If you're confused what this is, please check out Chapter 1, and that will explain it. Chapter 2. Isabella could not stop pacing. 2 levels down, the collected deans of the university were meeting. The list of accepted students could come out at any moment, and the lobby was full of prospective students. Over the last few weeks, dozens of young men and women had visited, having interviews and trying to convince the deans of their prospective schools to speak for them. Most had returned home, doomed to wait for the rejection or admission letter to arrive by telegraph or even ship for the outlying islands. But there were still at least a dozen prospective students waiting around, just in case they were admitted. Some had simply reserved their visits right before admission decisions, but some had come back across miles of sea and land in the assumption they would be admitted. If they got in, many of them would take the placement exam, and as soon as it was graded and their course of study was accepted, immediately start auditing classes. That was definitely Isabella's plan. She wouldn't be able to make any real headway on her degree until the term started in 6 months, but she was painfully excited about finally being let into the classrooms. And the sooner she got through the basic introductory classes and made herself really known to the professors, the sooner she could get involved in the School of Engineering's big project. It was the main reason that Isabella had made the push to apply when she was so comparatively young. She was only 19. Even Mark had been 23 when he had entered the university, and he had been younger than most of his classmates. So what chance did Isabella really have? She bit her lip and made another circuit of the lobby. One of the other waiting prospective students looked up from his books to glare at her. He was probably near 30, and was one of the many men who were poring over stacks of books, obviously studying for the placement exam. Isabella couldn't even imagine being sure enough of her admission to be studying right now. Plus, she had never been one for cramming. If she didn't know it now, she wouldn't after an hour or two of frantic reading. And that was assuming that the admission lists even came out in the next hour or two. She had watched prospective students waiting in the lobby for the past 5 or 6 years, and she knew there was no guarantee the list would be out any specific time of day. Isabella pulled out her fob watch and checked the time. It was only 1 o'clock. 3 years ago, the admissions list hadn't come out until 6 o'clock in the evening. It had been so late that the deans had suggested putting off the placement tests until the next day, but only one of the new students had chosen to wait. Isabella let out a voluminous sigh and sat down on one of the iron benches lining the windows. She should go get some lunch, or go on a walk to distract herself, but she knew the second she left the list would be posted. And what did that matter? A small, innately logical part of her mind asked. Would it really change anything for her to be one of the first to see the list? Whether or not her name was on it had absolutely nothing to do with her continued presence in the lobby. She forced herself to standing and took a step down the museum slope. The world would not end if she found out about her application standing 10 minutes later. She knew from past experience that she could walk the entire length of the museum up and down in just under 15 minutes. But if she actually took the time to at least vaguely look at the exhibits, she could probably stretch it to well over 2 hours. Isabella found it entirely impossible to focus on the exhibits around her. She had seen them all far too many times, and even if they had been brand new items, she was just too distracted. Barely 10 minutes had passed before she already covered 4 of the 10 floors. She was still at least a level above the tide line, and for the moment at least, she had given up on the exhibits and was just staring out over the waves. It was a calm day out there, the waves little more than gentle swells and bright aquamarine. Isabella could see all the way out to the shoal islands, the 12 steeply sloping islands that ringed the north side of the first island. There was not a cloud in the sky. Isabella sighed. It was too beautiful a day for bad news, but that wouldn't stop her from being rejected, and even if it was good news for her, it would be a bad day for well over 90% of all applicants. She took a deep breath and turned back down the museum, forcing herself to walk slowly. She turned to look at the statue next to her, a cracked but otherwise elegant piece of a tall man with wings. She stopped to read the legend attached, but the words meant nothing to her. They were just so many squiggles. She knew it too well for it to hold her attention. It took her a moment to recognize the presence of the beggar at the statue's feet. It was the blind man. His head was drooped down onto his arms, wrapped around his good knee. He looked to be asleep. Isabella took a step closer to the beggar. His hair had slipped over his shoulder, and a strand rested in front of his face, moving in and out with his gentle breathing. Isabella could not imagine being able to sleep in public, but then it was probably his only choice. Where did he go at night? Or did the security guards let him stay here all the time? Did he really make enough money begging in the museum to survive? There was a beggar's bowl in front of him, and with a quick glance, Isabella could see that it was not empty, but there did not seem to be that much money in it. How could he trust that the money would even still be there when he woke up? Isabella had been around the museum beggars for most of her life. Like many university children, her father had given her a copper coin to give to a beggar every Sunday after church, but she had never really thought about them before. Maybe he really was just a good distraction, but the blind man fascinated her. Most of the beggars in the museum were dirty, depressing, and just a little bit frightening. The blind man was not. Besides being clean and young, he just did not exude the aura of brokenness that most did, which was odd considering he was technically more crippled than many other beggars Isabella had seen in the museum. Sleeping there, beneath the statue, he looked like a work of art himself. This close, Isabella could clearly see the scars not quite entirely covered by the white blindfold. There was a certain emptiness behind the cloth that made Isabella's stomach clench. It almost looked like his eyes were completely missing. Isabella took a step back and suddenly realized that she was standing in the middle of the museum hall, staring at a sleeping beggar. She blushed, and dropped a handful of coins in his beggar's cup. The ringing sound of metal against metal was significantly louder than expected. The blind man sat up abruptly, startled awake. Isabella did not quite run. The beggar's voice followed her swiftly retreating footsteps, calling "thank you" as she rushed up the slope of the museum. When Isabella stepped back into the lobby, she was for once in the day not thinking about the list. She had forgotten about the prospective students entirely, and as she looked back over her shoulder in some irrational fear that the beggar would follow, she crashed in the same prospective student who had been glaring at her before. He had been pacing the lobby with his face in his book. When she slammed into him, he dropped his book, but she had not hit him nearly hard enough to throw either of them to the ground. "Watch where you're going, girl," he growled as he leaned down to retrieve the book. Isabella took a step back. The sheer annoyance in his voice and the insulting tone was both unexpected and uncalled for. She stood up straight and snapped, "Says the man reading while walking." His face darkened. "Excuse me?" Isabella had grown up around crotchety old men, many of whom were far too important or respected to bother with being polite to a young girl, and she would not be yelled at like a child by someone who had not even been admitted to the university yet. She raised an eyebrow. "You are excused." She moved to walk around him, but he stepped back in her way. "You need to learn to respect this institution, miss. This is a museum and a school, an institute of learning." "And?" "You should not be running, and you should look where you're going. Some of us are here to study." She had not been running, and yet most students managed to not run into young ladies while studying. His face brightened to a sharp red, and he glowered at her. "And what do you think you are doing here? This is no club for the local children to waste time in." Isabella searched for a biting retort, but before she could speak she saw something over his shoulder. The dean's secretary had just come out of the hall to the conference room, and there was a sheet of paper in her hands. Isabella offered the prospective student her winningest smile and brushed past him. It was rude, but then again, nothing about their interaction had been exceptionally polite. She followed the secretary to the bulletin board. The woman was already rearranging the postings that took up almost every square inch of the surface. Notices of research projects and calls for assistance, posters for lectures and presentations, all too important to be covered or taken down. Isabella's boots rang against the marble floor as she approached, and the secretary turned to greet her. Isabella smiled at her, trying to look calm, and was relieved when the woman smiled back. "Isabella, how are you?" "I'm fine, Mach. How are you?" Isabella forced her smile to remain in place. She liked Mach, and there was no reason to be rude just because she was dying of terror inside. Mach smiled back. "I'm wonderful, sweetie, but I'm sure you're not interested in small talk. I haven't opened the list yet, but if you want to while I'm tidying this up." She handed over the thick sheet, and Isabella had never loved her more. It was blank on the outside, folded over twice, and closed with a dab of wax. Isabella took a steadying breath, but before she could slide her finger between the leaves and break the seal, a voice startled her. "Don't be coy, little girl. If you're going to post a list, post it. Don't just stand there chatting." Isabella was really beginning to dislike this man. She took another breath, broke the wax seal, and unfolded the paper. She skipped the text at the top, asking admitted students to see the dean's secretary for more information, scanned the names quickly, and without a word, handed it back to Mach. The woman smiled deviously at her, and folded the list back up while she carefully, slowly, moved things around the bulletin board. Isabella stepped back through the prospective students, and the crowd closed around Mach, leaving her outside. It didn't matter if they left her out of their circle. She was in, and there was nothing they could do about it. Isabel was just turning away when the same man grabbed her arm. She looked down at it, but he didn't seem to get the message. "You saw the list?" More of the prospective students turned her way, having seen that Mach was taking her time. Mach could stretch a 2-minute task into 20 minutes when she wanted, and since she always got all her work done, and usually long before the professors or deans thought to check, no one would dare to tell her to move it along. One of the prospective students 2 years ago had been rude to her, and she had taken the list back into her office and sat on it for 3 hours until someone had politely asked if they could see it. "Was my name there?" "I'm sorry, but I don't know who you are." She hoped her tone made it clear that she had no desire to know, either. "James Mathers. Was my name on the list?" Isabella arched her eyebrow at him. "I didn't see. I was just looking for my own." "That's cute, but this isn't the list of this year's debutantes." Isabella wanted to slap him, but she had better breeding than that. "Why don't you check for yourself, then?" She pulled out of his grip easily and stormed off. But Isabella refused to let his rudeness tarnish her good mood. First, she would need to go tell her father that she had been accepted. Then she would find Mark. He should be in the library this time of day. Then she would go find herself some lunch. Maybe she would even be able to pull Mark away from his studies long enough for a celebratory lunch date before she took the placement exam. Congratulations. Isabella had not noticed the figure leaning against the wall until the soft voice pulled her attention. The blind man was half hidden in the gap between the steps and the first display. He had his head turned her way, but not quite pointed at her, in a way she couldn't help but find disconcerting. "Excuse me?" He offered her a surprisingly elegant shrug for someone leaning on a crutch. "I assumed you had been accepted at the university." For a moment Isabella could do nothing but stare at him. How had he known? Then she felt herself blushing. Of course he had heard her discussion with James Mathers, and anyone who had spent any time whatsoever around the museum would have been able to figure out what was going on. Isabella forced herself to smile, realized how silly that was, and did it anyway. "Thank you, sir. I must go tell my father, if you'll excuse me." She turned and started down the stairs. To her surprise, the blind man nodded and followed. "Do you mind company?" She shook her head, then feeling like an idiot, remembered to respond verbally. "Not in the least." Once again Isabella was struck with the easy way he moved. One of his hands trailed on the wall, but he barely even slowed when he started down the stairs, his crutch swinging out first to tap down on the run before his foot followed. It almost made sense. After all, Isabella did not look at the stairs as she descended either, but she did certainly enjoy the possibility of doing so. She found herself watching him and unconsciously holding her hands out, ready to catch him if he were to stumble. "Professor Reid will be proud." "You know my father?" He smiled. "I have heard him lecture, but I don't believe he would say he knew me." The man's voice was soft, but well-mannered, with only the slightest hint of an accent that Isabella thought had to come from one of the outlying islands. He didn't sound at all like what a beggar was supposed to sound like. There was something about the man's reserve that made Isabella curious. "Are you interested in history?" "I'm curious about his theories on the three-text stone." For some reason the blind man smiled, a simple expression that completely changed his face. Isabella caught her breath. That smile took years off her estimation of his age, and endeared her to him immediately. Her instincts were to ask the man if he had studied any of the mayor's relics, or ancient languages, or anything of the sort. But should she? He was blind. It wasn't like he was spending his weekends reading, and he certainly did not move like a man who had lost his sight recently. It must have been years since he went blind, yet she would guess him to be not much older than Mark. He had to have been very young indeed the last time he had even had the possibility of seeing the three-text stone. Why would he care? Isabella was at a loss. Finally, she shook her head to clear it and forced herself to speak. "Do you know much about the stone?" Maybe it was best to treat him like she would anyone else who expressed interest in her father's theories. He smiled again, lifting his hand off the wall just long enough to go around a display before returning to retrace his fingers along their path. I have heard your father and the other professors lecture on it many times. His theory about it being a treaty agreement is not very popular. Isabella had unconsciously followed him to hug the walls, and though it would take much longer than just striking through the middle of the hall, for the moment she did not mind. She smiled indulgently. It's really not. I do believe if it weren't for the fact that he is the head of the history department, the other professors would all be openly calling him insane. As is, they just quietly make remarks about jumping to conclusions. There was laughter in her voice, and that garnered an answering smile from the blind man. The past is slow to change. Isabella's eyebrows shot up. You believe him? Why would... She stopped herself. Why would he believe in a theory that he could not even see the evidence for? The blind man shrugged. It makes sense. It's not like people usually carve grocery lists into giant hunks of marble. They turned a corner, and the light caught his face, pooling deep shadows in the hollows behind his blindfold. There was no question. His eyes weren't just damaged. They were gone. Isabella couldn't even imagine what had happened to them. His missing leg was not that strange. It was a common injury for sailors on fishing vessels. Their legs got caught in the lines and nets, which, snapping taut, would cut straight through even the bone before the sailors could get loose. But his eyes? That was no birth defect or simple accident. What happened to your eyes? The words came out before she could stop them. Her hand flew to her mouth, but the damage was already done. The blind man said absolutely nothing. It was as if he had not even heard. Isabella was glad. She wished she hadn't asked, anyway. She swallowed, desperately looking for something else less awful to say. Have you heard Mark's theory about the other mayor's relics? No. Of course he hadn't. Mark hadn't even presented his research to the library yet. Mark is a language history student. He believes that the 4 items that the great university pulled from mirrors before it sank are all part of the same greater story. The stone table, the 3 text stone, the tri-pillars, and the mirror's tablet are all made of the exact same stone and weathered almost exactly the same way. And he has found what appears to be similar symbols on at least the 3 text stone, the stone table, and one of the 3 pillars, which are all available for public scrutiny. He is applying for access to examine the mirror's tablet. She was babbling, but she certainly knew a good bit about his theories by this point, and it filled the silence, and covered her flub. The blind man nodded absently, but could he even know what the other mayor's relics were? Other than the mayor's tablet, they were somewhat forgotten. No one lectured on them, very few even studied them anymore. The only thing that marked them as important relics were the small plaques saying how little was known about them. The tablet was only in better standing because there was a section that was actually in very early version of the modern language. From what had been successfully translated, it talked about a meeting of people from 3 distant islands. Why else would the great university save those specific items? Isabella had not expected him to actually engage in the conversation. It was one of the most hotly debated questions from the sinking of mirrors. Why had the greatest minds of the time saved those 4 bits of rock? And what had been so important that the 5 deans had gone back into the crumbling city to ultimately lose their lives when it fell into the sea around them? Every historian agreed that they had to be important, except for the few that argued that the stones were probably just in the way of the important relics that the men had gone back for. But no one could really understand why. Who really knows what they were thinking 500 years ago? The blind man stopped walking. Isabella turned back, worried. But he had not stumbled or fallen. He had just stopped in his tracks, with the shadows of the waves outside lapping at his feet. But he couldn't have known about the approaching waterline. It had to have just been a coincidence. He stood there, with one hand lightly brushing the wall and the other firmly wrapped around his crutch. His face was turned slightly away from Isabella, and after a moment she realized he was listening, probably to hear if she had continued on, leaving him. He looked incredibly lonely. Isabella did not move. She barely breathed, and in that moment she was imperceptible to him. He was completely alone, with the quiet sound of the waves brushing against the glass walls outside. "What's your name?" Isabella's voice came out quiet, as if it were oddly unwilling to break the silence. The question was a pale substitute for the questions she really wanted to ask. The blind man did not move, and for a second Isabella wondered if maybe she had imagined him entirely. Maybe he was just one of the statues that surrounded them. Then he smiled, though Isabella saw no happiness in the expression. "Call me Ward." His words were like that last smile, completely empty of feeling, and before Isabella could respond, he turned and started back up the museum. Isabella almost wanted to follow him, ask the questions she was too polite to ask. Who was he? Why was he begging in the museum? What had brought him to begging in the first place? Why had he reached out to her? But she suspected she would get the same answers he gave her when she asked about his eyes. She could ask the security guards. Mark had mentioned that they seemed to know him. Suddenly the memory of where she had been headed rushed back, and all thoughts of the odd beggar disappeared. Isabella smiled. She had been accepted to the university! She took the rest of the trip down the museum with a definitive skip to her step.